Yeah.
when you look at those little peaks and what comes up to it, and understanding the narrative that's led to that. You see, it's not just about science. You see, the thing which I had a criticism of a lot of very large tech companies getting involved in looking at neuroscience and measuring people's different responses using loads of different techniques, was that the lack of understanding about story, because you could, I mean, for example, they could say, right, we've looked at your film and we think this is not very good here because it's not engagement. They've got some way of calibrating an engagement, which I'm not saying is wrong, but they can't go to the director and say what. They just say it's not engaging because they have no really understanding about how that story has been told. What I tend to do is to have that knowledge, it's bringing the art and the science to understand that.
Welcome to Storytelling Insights, art, science, and great conversations with storytelling insights from researchers, artists, teachers, and many more. Okay, welcome Dr. Keith Bound. I'm so delighted to have you here. And we had a bit of a chat actually just before you came on about what an amazing journey that you've been on, and really pleased to have you here. Dr. Keith Bound is the founder of Receptive Cinema, and we're going to talk about the art and science of storytelling from his perspective. And I'll just welcome you, Keith, and just let you tell us a little bit about you and what you do.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Calvin, for having me on. I really appreciate it and your time. So from a Receptive Cinema, basically a lot of my work has been based from my PhD, which I completed at the end of 2016. And that was really about psychophysiological suspense and really defining a way we can measure suspense in modern day horror films. And really see how we can measure certain intense emotions, because it's quite a narrow sort of field that I'm in, really, because I look at myself more as a specialist in suspense and fear in terms of narrative and understanding the way that emotional responses work and operate, and how these can be really powerful. It can be used in a very powerful way to advance social change, for example. Because we sometimes need very powerful messages to trigger strong emotions. And of course, we're hardwired to be a bit anxious at times when any little stimulus comes into our vision, whether it's periphery vision or not. Our brain is assessing that immediately. So, for example, if you're on a rather cold, icy day, and a car suddenly slide into you and you jump out the way, you think, oh, well, I saw that. But you didn't actually. You actually moved before you even know that the car was there. It's your senses are all automatically aware of these things. So you actually instinctively respond. And basically, this is what's quite interesting about fear and suspense. And when you look into horror films, regardless whether you like them or not, they're a really good sort of tool to use in understanding the narratives. Because, for example, if generally speaking, you say, well, what is suspense like, and really I look at that as sort of a mediating element of a sort of cause and effect paradigm that affects a conflict in the story that obviously triggers, fluctuations of anxiety, or it can be a direct threat to the viewer. So there's different ways that suspense can arise, but it is, the interesting thing about suspense is it's in every genre, because we always usually have some sort of conflict where the protagonist is on a journey. And if they're not really having a bit of a difficult time in that journey and everything's quite nice, we find it much harder to resonate with that, because, it captures our interest when something is being taken away that probably we sort of embrace with. So if we start to like a certain character, or we like the sort of type of story that we're going to listen to, it's really those juicy bits usually are the bits that really we don't really want to see. Right. And you can get people who watch certain films and then they know what's going to happen, and what I found in the study is that they have a stronger response rather than a weaker response, because they're already in that sort of pre-anxiety motion, because they know what's coming up. So it is quite interesting that you can actually define this, but suspense is such a powerful thing. But most people think suspense is orchestrated in a certain, in just one way. But I was looking in this study at different types of suspense narrative structures. Now, the way my work is about really tiny film clips here. Now, this might sound a bit strange, but what I did was I looked at various horror films, and I worked from Susan Smith's book on Hitchcock, and she actually defined some micro-narrative structures called direct suspense, shared, and vicarious suspense. Now, these are different ways that we actually experience suspense, and they're very tiny. They could be a few seconds long. They could be, all my clips are between 1 second and 90 seconds. So it's not very long, but you'll be amazed how people respond in a very short period of time, because they still, even if you extract that clip from a film, they still see it as a general story.
Yeah.
Even though it's a very tiny little chunk of it, they still see that as a story. So when we're looking at, say, shared suspense, is where we know the character knows they're in danger, or they may be fighting for their life, or on a cliffhanger, literally. And so we share their sort of experience of suspense. Vicarious suspense is very much sort of Hitchcock's favourite form of suspense, and that's usually when the protagonist does not know they're in danger, or if they do know they're in danger, they don't know the danger's right behind them, for example, and we do. Yeah. So we know what's going on. So you can get real complex patterns of vicarious suspense in terms of narrative, which was interesting in the study. The other sort is direct suspense. And direct suspense is where, a camera might go through a very dark room and we're following the camera. We're not got other characters possibly around at all. And because the suspense is directed at us. So in other words, it might be someone going, boo, or making you jump, or a surprise sort of thing that triggers a certain type of storytelling that gets that sense of anxiety. So it could be a chase with someone or whatever, So direct suspense, but direct suspense is quite interesting because we can also break down not just the cinematography side of things in terms of narrative little structures here, but we also look at sound. Peter Hutchins, a big writer on horror, he was looking at how sound musical scores and how musical sound is used in a certain way where they create dissonance in the tonality and really create a discordant sound. Now, a very popular discordant sound you hear in horror films is usually a stinger. Now, a stinger is usually when you get a sudden shock. Right. So it's usually a surprise, and usually it's like you hear it and then there's something there. Exactly. It's sometimes not even the actual antagonist. It could be a cat that jumps out and you get the sounds. They tease you with it, and then they probably hit you again later or shortly afterwards with something. Yeah. And that was very traditional horror. I think that, you particularly see that in the older Halloween type films. That those type of films around the 80s and 70s, they really used stinger quite a lot. Yeah. But the sound is really important. As Peter Hutchins says, it's really horror. It's a sound-based medium. Yeah. Even though we might see certain types of emotions like disgust, like something that's really bad, but disgust is, although that works with certain types of horror, most people can get quite banal about that, to be honest. They know that's there, and it makes you either a bit squeamish or it makes it a bit sickly, but it doesn't really do much. But the suspense side of things, of keeping people in this state of tension, is something that really brings, really engages people. And
that's amazing. I actually have a question for you. Actually,
sure,
just listening. So, what I'd really love what you said there about, earlier on you talked about it being a potentially very powerful way to affect social change. So the way the stories are told, and fear and suspense. So I guess the first question is, what's the difference between fear and suspense? I guess that's one question. But the other thing that's really fascinating is, it seems that we love this. You talk about horror films, you talk about, I actually I actually remember doing some stuff in my media studies back in college quite a while ago, and we did Hitchcock, and a lot of it was like, The Birds, North by Northwest, some really classic films, and we love going back to them. So in the story, so I guess the first question is, what is the difference between fear and suspense? And then the second thing is that in the story, it seems like it's such an integral part of storytelling. Why do we love it so much?
Well, that's interesting. But I think that, well, first of all, about fear and suspense,
yeah,
we can get suspense where we have a romantic situation. So, for example, you could get really into a very romance type of romantic film, and then they have their journey. I mean, you could look at the Titanic is a good example, possibly there. The love story and the tragedy of the event that we all knew was going to happen before we watched the film. So we knew that, so again, we're knowing that, but it will still actually trigger just a stronger anxiety response than if you was watching a horror film. In fact, it might even trigger a stronger one. I do not know that, but it could do, because some horror films are so predictable that you don't even get the suspense. So you don't even get that sort of feeling. It's got to be a different sort of emotion. I think that we mentioned Halloween. I would reckon that if we went back in time, and you would have to do this, and we went back in the late 70s when we saw the first Halloween film, and we measured people's responses, they would be pretty strong. They won't be today because it's different. And it brings on your other point about the birds, because I remember in a pre-test I did that really I used a scene from the birds, but responses were really pretty poor, and they would be. And if the reason is that we've moved on, it's like you look at Jaws. I mean, I didn't use Jaws. I mean, all the films I used were in this part of the 21st century to get it up to date. Because when you start to use other different ones from different eras, it could really be
there's a lot of context, I suppose.
I remember being at Jaws in the cinema, and it was packed. We queued up, and I remember going in the cinema and seeing it, and these girls were hysterical now to get them to take out. You heard that all over the country. They put this fantastic, see what they did, they primed people well. You see, again, this is another thing, is they primed them with a great big massive shark, which was bigger than the one in the pictures. It was bigger than the film, on a poster. And he saw this little tiny swimmer at the top. And I think that prompted it. Plus, they knew that there was going to be a different sort of special effects and everything else. So I think that happened, but it did trigger, I mean, the way that it was done, it did trigger a really strong. Now, you look at Hitchcock, again, go back to Hitchcock films, I bet if you measured them at the time, then you would have, got a very sort of strong response. Psycho would have got a very strong response, but it won't now, because what will happen now, you have to bring nostalgia as a feeling or a sort of emotion that people might have. In other words, there are certain films that we might feel endearing towards, and we might watch them many, many times. I mean, I watched, we look at the Titanic. I'm one of these romantic people, I suppose, and I think I watched that at least 9 times, not over straight away, but usually every Christmas, I would actually watch, and I would get more or less a similar reaction at the end, and bawl my eyes out or something like that, but that's fine. But what I'm saying is that, so you can get that, but it is a bit more nostalgic. It's like sometimes you want to feel a certain experience. You might watch a film because it inspires you. It really gives you a sense of inspiration. So I think that when we're looking at, first of all, that fear, the difference between fear and suspense, we can see it from different genres. It doesn't always have to be a scary. And even Hitchcock said that it doesn't have to be something scary. And he gives an example similar to what I've done there. But
so
I think
it's really then about that anticipation. So the integral part of the story here is the, what's going to happen next? Ooh, what's going to happen next? And are we kind of just literally just behind the curve of the story going, ooh, what's going to happen now? What's going to happen now? And are there chemical changes going on in us at the same time? Or why do we love it so much?
Well, I think it's actually, I think the reason why we might love it is because we're not in our caves anymore, as our ancestors were, and chasing saber-toothed tigers. You know, today we probably engage in competitive sport or something else that we have, that we need to gain something that's engagement. Also, when you're going to the cinema, it's safe. You can see a psychopath do what they want if you want to, and you'll save. So that's where it becomes entertaining because of the type of story that may be used around it, sort of thing, you know. So I think that's the thing. The other thing is we also have to realise is with particularly suspenseful anxiety now, our brain processes a fear response in 40 milliseconds, right? So that's probably roughly a frame. If we're looking at 25 frames per second, that's 250 images that you'll see in a second, you know, over that time period. So when you think about that, so in other words, you could have, if you ever did, say, put a picture of someone with a great big tarantula spider on their face and showed it to someone, okay, if they're really scared of spiders, they wouldn't want to get near the screen. But if you showed them a 10-second movie of that tarantula moving on the face, that would have bigger impact. But like you said, when we add sound, I think you need sound most of the time. It's got to be used in the right way, of course, because the sound's got to really reinforce what the visual message is usually, you know.
Yeah.
And sometimes silent is good as well. You know, as we can have silence, and that's probably when we get a more direct suspense, because then we'll just narrow, you know, we're getting it directed towards us. But a lot of people don't realise that these structures are so small. You know, I mean, in fact, they're even combined, called a composite form of suspense. So you have a combination of some of these elements, and that could happen within 10, 15, 20 seconds. But then you start to look at, well, what about adverts? Because commercials, they're on about 30 seconds. And Linda Hallowell did a lot of research in suspenseful adverts. And what they found was that people found that the speed of the advert was much quicker in a suspenseful advert because they were so intensified in the story very rapidly and quickly. And I think in the UK, the ones I've seen that seem to be more suspenseful are the ones done by the military usually. They do some very careful ones about attracting people, you know, to special forces and that sort of thing. So they do a little story in a jungle somewhere or something like that, or some drugs thing or whatever, but they do it very quickly.
Yeah.
And you're engaged in it. That's what I'm saying. You don't have to have big, long films. You can get quick messages quite quickly. And when you think that how our brain's processing these things, I measured using two little sensors, which are on the distal phalanges here. And basically, it was measuring their anxiety response using the electrical changes in the skin, because that's one of the real nice physiological responses that we can measure. Obviously, these days, I think now our technology has gone forward, particularly with our mobile devices are used, even our laptops and computers, we get facial recognition systems. So I do think that because they've done a lot more, there's a lot of work done in actually understanding their emotions, using their facial expressions. I mean, the work was started, you know, back in the 40s, 50s. But what I'm saying is now they got really sophisticated models where they look at micro expressions, because we never really experience one emotion. It's very rarely, well, I don't know how you could do that, because there's a blend of what's there. Like I said, we've talked about horror. You might have discussed here that about this sort of scale, and then you've got fear there. You might have anxiety in different ways. Yeah. So think about someone in a film looking at someone where their lover's gone off with someone else. They love them, but they also probably may not like them because they've done that sort of thing. So you've got conflicting emotions and that sort of thing. So I think that you know, using the facial expressions with eye tracking would be a really good method. And I like the electrodermal activity, that, you know, this electrical change of the skin, but I would use that more with those. So it would inform you more about that process. I mean, obviously, there are more elaborate methods that some people have been using, I don't know, since probably even, I would say around 2006, probably 2007. Some of the big movie places did use some neuroscience where they did brain scans and that sort of thing. The trouble is with when you go into a scanner, you can create anxiety just by being in the scanner. If you're showing a film and that's not necessarily going to necessarily go away that anxiety, that clunking machine in the background, or the way that it might be operating around you. But it's not only that, it's where you position your head. It can actually affect the blood vessels in the brain, so how you're processing things can be different. Now, I'm not saying all these things, they may have some ways of doing it, but it's still an issue. You know,
so in your research, you used measuring the electrical signals on the skin in the story. We're on this journey of the story, and then there's suspense, there's anticipation, then there's even after the moment when we go, oh my gosh, or you know, that moment happens. What's going on in what actually registers? What change is happening there?
Well, the signal, usually you get a very background sort of feeling. So it could be a sort of very sort of like wavy feeling. And that's really just skin conductance in a general sort of format. Yeah. When you look at those little peaks and what comes up to it and understanding the narrative that's led to that, you see, it's not just about science. You see, the thing which I had a criticism of a lot of very large tech companies getting involved in looking at neuroscience and measuring people's different responses using loads of different techniques was that the lack of understanding about story. You know, because you could, I mean, for example, they could say, right, we've looked at your film and we think this is not very good here because it's not engagement. They've got some way of calibrating an engagement, which I'm not saying is wrong, but they can't go to the director and say what. They just say it's not engaging because they have no really understanding about how that story has been told. What I tend to do is to have that knowledge, it's bring in the art and the science to understand that. What I was looking at was the actual curve. So the rise time, and then it comes up to the peak.
Yeah.
That section was really where I was interested. And there's also a point before the rise time. There's the stimulus maybe over here, but you don't get the rise time until a bit later. I was looking at anxiety, durability through its duration of that rise time. And then I was looking at intensity at that level. And then I was managed to get about two different types. There's the short duration within a standard psychophysiological measurement, which is about 3 seconds. And I went outside their boundary for ones that I thought were stronger, and they were quite clear. There's no reason why we couldn't use these. And these were showing someone who had much more stronger anxiety, a longer thing. So the shorter ones may be more sort of sometimes to do with people getting sudden shocks or sudden spurts of anxiety. Yeah. But they don't last long because they go up and they come back down. Now the seconds aren't, you know, you think, well, that's not much.
That's happening in a single frame. So yeah. So the rational mind's not comprehending what's, you know, the rational mind doesn't have the opportunity to say, you know, let's say it was a spider. I just saw a spider. The rational mind doesn't have the time to do that. But the skin and the electrical signature is still changing.
Yeah.
Even though it's just flashed by in 40, you know, microseconds or milliseconds.
Well, the thing is, you see, what you do when we get a stimulus that we probably don't even see sometimes, our brain is processing that. Anything that's not, that you're not used to, or maybe sudden or unexpected, it comes in your peripheral vision. What happens is your amygdala, your defense mechanism in your brain, suddenly starts to process that. And it goes through the hypothalamus and the brainstem, and they go through a neural network, really, of really, like, for example, it will go straight away. First of all, it will go to a direct route to the neocortex and try to recall past memories of what's gone on before. Do I recognize this? Now, if you've gone to horror films and you love horror films, then that's just going to reinforce your emotion and feeling. Or unless you are so banal about the horror, but you still watch them, then probably it will still be quite banal. It depends on where you are with it. But basically, if it's something new, then that triggers a much stronger response. Is this a real threat? And if your memory from your past experience or watching films doesn't come up with that, then it does go into this sort of, you will then have a stronger skin conduction response straight away.
Yeah.
And you'll have this instinctively before you've even realized it, you know. So although you might think, oh, I know that's a spider, and you think, well, that's quickly. No, your brain's reacted much earlier than that.
Yeah.
Because it triggered this response. So that's the way these techniques, I'm not saying they're all perfect, because these mechanisms, although skin conduction has been used since the late 1880s, But what I'm saying is it's a little bit more sophisticated now, but all these techniques do have their downsides, you know.
Yeah.
And I think the ones I just mentioned, like facial expression and eye tracking, are probably the best, because you can actually detect a certain emotion by the emotion, and also you can see what they're looking at. Now, when you look at eye tracking, for example, most people, although the eye tracking will be attracted to light and things like that, very much to light in where light is, and your eyes will go to that direction, or when someone's speaking, that sort of thing. But usually the lighting in the set is put in a certain way that they want to direct your attention.
Yeah.
And that does work. But what happens is, after a while, if you watch the whole film, eventually the direction goes in the center of the screen after a while, which is really bizarre, really. But it's still useful, because when there's new information, particularly coming from the sides, or there's, you know, another, you know, it has a cut, a certain type of cut that will change things. So your brain's actually taking that other clip in. And I think, although this sounds really quite strange and mechanical when we look at, say, frames, but our brain works like that in real life. We think we see a seamless edge of, when we look around, we don't see any sort of cuts or anything, but your brain is stitching static images of whatever we see.
So I know that we're speaking specifically about how these kind of, the brain works, the body processes a lot of information outside of our sort of conscious attention, but it has the physiological effect is still present, and sometimes we can't tell, or maybe let me find a better way to play that back. Maybe is that the experience, whether it's actually happening or not, the body is responding in an identical way or a very similar way.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned something really caught my attention there, which was the imagination. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about imagination, and, you know, we create a narrative then, which, because I know you were talking, up until just now, we were talking a lot about the science, but you also mentioned a really important element, if you really want to have a holistic approach, which is your expertise, is to understand the narrative itself. Yeah. So in the imagination, and we create the narrative in our minds or head, or whichever, with our brains, whatever, we're internally creating this through our imagination. We can create an experience which feels so real to us. Does it become real? Can we, I know we're venturing a little bit outside the storytelling scope, but I'm just really fascinated by this link between the imagination and how that changes the physiological response, and how that physiological response maybe creates an experience for us that subsequently becomes real.
Well, it does actually, and to some extent, I had evidence in my study. So, because what I did was I used 3 data sets. I was looking at those narrative structures in different films, the ones I mentioned, Vicarious Show, and Direct. And then also I was looking at the physiological data, but also getting feedback. So every time they watched a clip, they would have 30 seconds to say whatever came to their mind. And I used keywords from that to really understand what they were actually talking about, you know, and that sort of thing. But you find that what I found was that some people, and there's a natural expression for this, it's called narrative transportation. And basically, it's when we transport ourselves into the story and we feel we're part of the story. And I had those comments. It was like they just felt they were there, and it really made them feel much more stronger responses. And that was shown by the physiological responses, as well as what they were saying. There was a real big match before that. And the thing is, you've also got to say, how do we process narrative as we watch a film? We're always predicting what's going to happen. In our own mind, as we go through the story, we think, this is going to happen, that's going to happen, or whatever. And then we either get that sort of either fulfilled in a certain way, or then we get a sudden change in direction of narrative. And that can really take us in another direction emotionally or whatever, you know, and think in different ways. So we are using our imagination a lot when we're even just thinking we're just watching a film. Because most people think watching a film is very passive, and it isn't. It's not
It's a
passive.
very active
There's a
experience.
lot more going on than people realise. People just assume that if we're doing something interactive, yeah, you are doing something more physically. You're competing. You're actually involved in way, but you are with a film.
Where did I read there was a bit of research done into kids who read Harry Potter, and not Harry Potter. It was the vampire one. It was the vampire. I think some were done on Harry Potter, yes, but there was some kids who had the Twilight show, and there's the vampire and the wolves, and the people who'd finished reading that, the youngsters, they actually believed that when that's how long they thought their teeth were, they actually felt that their teeth were longer than they actually were, having watched that film. So I guess that narrative transportation literally directly influences how we perceive our reality afterwards.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, it's going back to the girls in that audience watching Jaws years ago, and they had to leave the cinema. It's a bit like sometimes you think about, you have a dream, you have a bad dream, and when you wake up in the morning, it sticks with you for the day or half of the day, that sense of mood. You see, the thing is, these things do trigger. And then the thing is, obviously, when you go and see a horror film, you're developing a mood already, and all the other stimulus, like the trailer or any of the build up for you to go to, say, the cinema to see and watch it, is always building up this thing. And your brain knows that what you want to watch is horror. One thing which I didn't touch on, which I wanted to touch on, is where we look at historically, look at suspense. Because if we look at historically, when we look at the film industry, they couldn't make long feature films back in 1900s and that, and they had the perils of Pauline, the theory of her being, I don't think she was actually trapped on the railway lines as we're waiting for a train to run her over. But the point is, these very short movies were probably 30 minutes, if that, some of them. The speed of them could have been various because they're measured on feet in them days, not how much longer they would be in there. And then in these Nickelodeon cinemas, and what they would do, you see, they understood, the people who are making the films, that we make sure that we have a cliffhanger right at the end, and so people come to the cinema to see the next installment of the story, because that's the thing, they could only do so much with these films. They couldn't make them. In fact, they started to make it. That's why they started making films in Hollywood. When they could make longer films, they wanted it to be sunny or whatever, But this thing about suspense was a financial driver, not just a story driver, and that's why it's worked so well. And of course, the cliffhanger comes back from some book in 1873 in the literature, literally a cliffhanger, but that was used. But a lot of this, also this,
where they were actually left holding on to a cliff.
Well, that's why
that's the origin of it, is it?
Yeah.
Oh wow!
But that goes back to literature. But
you mentioned that there was a real commercial driver for the suspense and that kind of thing, the cliffhanger, because of course it helped them to keep audiences coming and keep them engaged. But actually, your speciality, when you talk about the holistic world, and I'm very interested in this myself too. My angle, of course, as you know, is the combining the mindfulness and the storytelling for helping us to transform ourselves and tell better stories for our collective nature. But you're saying that it's a good driver for social change. So in terms of this kind of social change angle, we're really interested to hear a little bit more about how do you foresee, I suppose, probably the social change being carried forward through this medium.
Okay, well, I suppose I did a talk at Florida at the Frank
talk on Frank, Frank 2020. That was excellent.
Yeah, and that was really about that. I'd been to the university a year before, just as I passed my PhD, and I went out there, and they invited me out there because I was doing a lot of work in the science of storytelling, in particular in this area. And they were fascinated by this, and they wanted me to come back. But this was the event that happened, and it was really good because it also gave me a sort of thinking. Well, I think, well, first of all, if we want to change political and cultural resistance to certain things. And in fact, I have to say this, the governments do this quite well. I mean, they use fear constantly, and the mass media do, in terms of making people feel vulnerable. So they take advantage of what? But the point is, it helps to control in that sense. But I'm trying to look at it in a different context, where we can actually make meaningful stories. Now, I give an example of a UK, it was a government sort of promotional video on to stop people smoking. And so I did that. And what basically they were doing in this commercial was they were using a cancer growing from a cigarette, for example. So they're using disgust. And then they actually have a statement saying, if you smoke 15 cigarettes a day, it's more likely to actually change your human cells and you're more vulnerable, they'll mutate and more likely to be cancer. So that was really the message through the whole thing, those 2 points. But, and basically they interviewed people afterwards, said, wow, that, some of them gave up smoking, and all the rest of it. But when you actually start to look at the data of how many of the smoking population had declined, during that program, not just the program, I'm talking about what that whole promotional thing was over a year, and only 1% of the smoking population had given up. There are other issues, you see, that people don't realise that to consider, that need to be bridged over. I mean, it can be certain addictions, it can be lots of other things, and maybe sometimes that don't work. But the way I was looking at this is that they were just using disgust. They could use suspense or look at how certain narrative structures might work more effectively to gain the message, because what they're doing is they're focusing very much on the fear, but they're not really showing the benefits of not smoking.
Yeah. And if you mentioned, as you mentioned earlier, like sometimes people with the narrative transportation, they get so invested in that character, they almost become that character. And I guess if there's no upside other than, so for me, in my mind, I'm drawing a parallel with, you mentioned historically, people don't really get scared of Jaws anymore, or the original Halloween, or even Hitchcock, because times have moved on. But also maybe we get desensitized to the same tricks, right? And if they're just scaring us as the viewer, I say, then if we're using stories just to scare people, but we're invested in the character and all the character wants to do is run from the fear, eventually I guess we get desensitized to that too. Is that kind of something that may be happening? Why the people aren't saying, well, actually, the compelling reason, the benefit, the upside for me and me as this character in this narrative isn't really there. They just fall off a cliff, so to speak.
Well, actually, it's a very good point you make. And in fact, I've got to go back to one of the clips, a descent. And what my techniques do, which I really have not really mentioned, is that it's really, with the information, the data I've got, I can actually identify filmmakers' narrative blind spots. And this is not a criticism of filmmakers, but because they do not work with a scientific evidence-based model as well as a creative element. They are basing their decisions purely on a creative and aesthetic appeal, and now they feel the story should work. There's nothing wrong in that. But the problem is in doing that, I found that you can find where the things they thought were going to really be really suspenseful within these tiny clips, that they weren't. And in fact, actually, they lost the audience. What I'm saying is there are narrative understanding and how things are building up within a short clip, and that clip was probably only 30 seconds long. So when you're looking at a 30-second clip, I know it sounds it's very micro, but when you think, as I go back to how our brain processes certain stimulus within 40 milliseconds, we need to actually get to that level of detail and understand how that is. So I think that's the way that people get very disengaged. But in the case of social change is a bit different, because I think the fear and suspense can be used very effectively. But as I mentioned about, suspenseful adverts like the military, going into the jungle and all the rest of it, that works really well. Mm-hmm. And the thing is with the smoking side, that, by utilizing suspense rather than a disgust thing, but it's actually also we want to see the protagonist survive, really. I mean, I have to say, I'm not saying for everyone, but for me, a lot of horror films, most people get killed off, which really, is not that good, really, because if you know that all the time, then it's not really, you think, well, it's just really a case of how they're going to die that I'm going to see, and it takes away from the story. But when you do get a survivor, it can be sometimes a bit more rewarding, but
yeah,
it depends. I'm not saying that's good or bad, but I do think that when you're doing something like a government promotional video, you want to get the fear, you want to get the suspense, because if you don't do that and dig that deep emotional, you're not going to get their attention. But what you want to do is to show the benefits of not smoking. So if that had shown someone then who wasn't smoking and they were engaging, even if it looked a bit artificial, it wouldn't matter. The point is it would resonate with people. There's some sort of benefit.
Wow, Dr. Keith Bound, I'm so interested in all of this, and I'm just first of all, thank you for coming along and sharing your insights. I think the things that sort of popping out at me, having sort of gone through that conversation with you. So there is a story within a story, within just literally 10 seconds, 5 seconds. And this is quite interesting because this is something myself and, my mindfulness teacher and friend, Shamash Aladina, we teach in our mindful storytelling, is that when we go through that hero's journey of our own lives, we can go into a very tiny stage, one step on the hero's journey, and zoom in like fractals.
Exactly.
And unpack that, and then that becomes a complete story, and then you zoom in again and that becomes a complete story, and on it goes. So actually I'm hearing this as well from the scientific work that you do, and breaking the films down into even just one frame. So there is that kind of thing that I'm hearing coming through. Also, even though when I first set out in this conversation with you, and I thought this is going to be really a narrow, sort of laser focused specialist area, it sort of opened out actually into, as we heard, some of the really powerful motivational parts of the suspense, but also when it comes to affecting social change, actually there is another side of that perhaps we need to make sure there's included, so that within the horror genre, absolutely the fear and suspense works, and if it ends there, it's great. That's that part of the story. But actually you may have another narrative that you want to tell, or different use. And when it comes to social change, you're saying that actually there are limitations to just using the fear as a motivator, because it's incomplete, which is, I guess, part of your reason of being a holistic artist and scientist. You kind of help people to see that in your work. And I guess the other thing that I learned as well is that, which is not surprising, is it's just so rich, this kind of subject matter, that, which is why it's so interesting, and I appreciate you're exploring it with me. In the few episodes gone by, which we've had people talking about narrative infrastructure and layering stories onto physical space to help with town planning. We've talked about journaling and the narratives that we have internally. We're hearing this from a very bespoke perspective in film and receptive cinema with you, and we're going to actually be having some more people talking about that from a psychological point of view. So thank you for
having us as well. I mean, it's been really interesting. The whole discussion's been really great. But I do think it is that, when you look at a lot of science that are looking at measuring responses, they very rarely do something. One is having an understanding of narrative and understanding, well, okay, we may have that spike there and it means that, but what happened before, and what was going on, and how those spikes might relate to this, even within a short clip. And you actually start to really, you're going into a lot of detail, but it's important, because if we can get in that very microscopic level, we can start to understand the whole.
Oh, before you go, I just want to say thank you for tuning in. Please subscribe to my channel. It means a lot more than you know. And I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Bye for now.